Ki te whare toi. My name's Graham Frost. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator here at City Gallery Wellington te whare toi, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to another edition of City Talks. City Talks is an ongoing series initiated by the New Zealand Institute of Architects in partnership with City Gallery Wellington. Just before we hand over to Tina Williams from the Wellington branch, I'll just do a little bit of housekeeping. If you need to use the restroom, the wharepaku, we have a set of restrooms just out of the main doors at the end of the corridor. It's very unlikely that we'll have an emergency of some kind, but in the case that we do, to safely evacuate this building, you can use the emergency exit just to your right at the end of the auditorium here, or through the glass doors upon exiting the main doors of the auditorium. And our rally point, in the case of an emergency, is the blue mat outside Nikau Cafe. In other words, just stay calm and follow the instructions of our staff. And now it's my pleasure to pass the microphone over to Tina. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou, welcome everyone. Right, well, today we talk about a certain building. The demise of Athfield's first church of Christ Scientist, big name, was a rupture in Wellington's urban fabric and its core identity. As a building, it truly was one of a kind. No matter who you were or how much you knew about architecture, you couldn't pass by this building without forming an opinion. I'm sure this loss didn't go unnoticed by many of you here tonight, but it did seem strange how quickly it seemed to slip away. We at Te Kahului Whahanga Wellington want to take this opportunity to acknowledge an iconic building. And today we have the pleasure of having Dr. Kate Linzey to guide us through the remnants. Kate is an architectural scholar who completed her PhD at ATCH at the University of Queensland. Her spin-off article, which you may know her from, reflects part of her new research, which investigates the role of craft arts in post-war Aotearoa architecture. So Kate will soon present her slides, and afterwards we'll be taking questions. And for those of you online, please feel free to post those in the comments section. And then after that, for those of you in person, we can further this discussion in the foyer and share stories over nibbles and drinks. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Kate.
So there it is. So this is why I'm here. I wrote this article. I was asked by Object Space Gallery, who commission work, or they fund the work of this series through the spin-off, to talk about the demolished First Church of Christ Scientist. It's a really hard one to say because it really should have more grammar there. The First Church of Christ, the Scientist, but no, it's just comma scientist. Anyway, sorry. And so they invited me to talk about that work because I had written something for a Wellington artist called Crafty, and she had made some artworks in relation to the demise of, or the decline of, the Gordon Wilson Flats. So I kind of work in this realm between architecture and art, and these days also a little bit more and more towards architecture and craft, whatever that is. Okay, so I'd just like to thank the NZIA, Amelia and Tina, for expressing an interest in the article that I wrote and then the invitation to come and talk. And thank you to the gallery and the gallery staff for making this all happen so smoothly. It's great. And thank you all for coming out, because it sure is cold and horrible out there. So we'll see how we go. Okay, so this is a quote that Julia Gatley includes in Athfield Architects, the monograph on the Athfield practice. Is it a whale? Is it a turtle, a praying mantis, or perhaps a prehistoric monster rearing its head over Willis Street, Wellington? It indicates something of the, humour and something of the slight patronising ridicule of the building that was going on when it was first unveiled in 1983. And where was it? Just in case you didn't know, it was sitting here on Willis Street. And here are the details of the sale, the application for demolition, 8th of June. Hunt, so that quote up there is from the Tom Hunt article that was printed in June. And then the application was approved on the 1st of August, and then demolition was occurring by the 4th of September. Can't do my months. So within sort of 3 months of the notification, the building was, being flattened, and it was kind of shocking and almost impossible for us to mobilise to protect the building, not least of all, I guess, because given its age, it being very young, and the fact that modern contemporary heritage, which can we call it heritage, but anyway, contemporary building is not protected under anything, and so we are purely dependent on the goodwill of property owners and exerting their private property rights to preserve things. Okay, so within the limited time frame, there was a number of people, like Tom Hunt and Mark Amery, who were able to produce articles about the demolition. There was Simon Devitt, who stepped in and photographed the demolition process, and through some sort of nifty, crafty even negotiations, Athfield were able to salvage some parts of the building with the sort of collaboration of the demolition crew. As a consequence of that, or in relation to that, Object Space stepped in. So that's Kim Patton as the director, Zoe Black is the deputy director, and Victoria McAdam, who manages communications and partnerships, of which Athfield's, I believe, is one. They stepped in to curate the show. So this is the show, Less Than 5%. It's just closed yesterday. They've been having a number of events associated with it, which I think have been quite successful. And the show is about to head off down to Christchurch to open in the new Sir Miles Warren Gallery that Object Space has opened down there. So if you're in Christchurch, you can go catch it. So the title, Less Than 5%, is in reference to the 5% of the budget that Athfield was quite proud to have allocated towards artworks in the construction of the building. It's perhaps a little bit of a pun on the fact that in 1983, just after this, the City Council, the Wellington City Council, initiated an arts bonus scheme. And in that scheme, it was just 1% of a building project that would go to art in exchange for 5% of increased building space. So he put 5% of the budget into the art and didn't get any extra space. But anyway, that's all right. So the four artworks recorded as the capitals of the building, from which we can see little bits of this, that were designed and produced by Claire Athfield and Neville Porteous. A Doreen Bloomhart ceramic wall, a James Walker glass window, and some textile works by Jenny Hunt. And as is the nature of all textiles works, they've completely evaporated. I don't know what happened to those. But the other three items persist. The window went to the congregation of the First Church, and Athfields were able to pick up the capitals and the Doreen Bloomhart. Right. So it feels a bit crazy for me to try to introduce Ian Athfield, but I'm going to do it anyway. I only met him a couple of times. And one of those times he gave me a bit of a ribbing because my students were doing a heritage preservation project. And he said, oh, they've got to be, more bold about how they use heritage buildings. And I was like, no, let the students learn about heritage buildings. But anyway, it was all right. So the brief biography. Athfield grew up in Christchurch. He wanted to become an architect from a very young age. He started working for Sir Miles Warren, and at that time he was exposed to the kind of late modern, expressive, almost brutalist architecture that has that kind of Christchurch modernism, white boxes, sharp roofs. What Kenneth Frampton would call a kind of critical regionalism. Between 61 and 63 he travelled to Auckland to complete his qualifications, at which he was recorded as not being particularly impressed by Vernon Brown or the group, but that he did like Antonio Gaudi, Mies van der Rohe, and the visiting European architect Aldo van Eyck. While he was studying in Auckland, this is where he met Claire Athfield, who was at the Teachers Training College at the time. But then, on graduating, they moved back to Wellington, or moved down here to Wellington, sorry. He got a job at Structon, which sounds quite miserable, and then in 1968 he moved into solo practice, being joined by Ian Dixon and Graham Boucher in 69 and 70 respectively, and then Claire Athfield officially joined the practice as an interior designer in 1971. So Claire at the College of Education had been specialising in art education, and in the art craft world, the avenue of studying art through the College of Education is quite profound. If anyone knows who Gordon Tovey is, you'll go, oh yeah, that guy. Okay, so Athfield, depicted as the fuzzy enfant terrible through the 70s, developed the materiality and formally rich architectural language that many now see as characterising Wellington's most distinctive architecture, along with the likes of Roger Walker and Dave Launder. Then there's the infamous 1975 project, the winning competition entry for the squatter housing in the Philippines. That all went a little bit awry. In 1986, there was a US tour up from down under, where Athfield travelled around with Raewey Thompson, Roger Walker and John Blair. So he was exposed to a substantial array of American US postmodern architecture at this time. The practice under Athfield's name continued to grow and exert an increasing influence on the Wellington cityscape. In early 1989-90, Athfield, Frank Gehry and Raewey Thompson submitted an entry for the design of the new Museum of New Zealand. And while it was not successful, the Athfield firm was undertaking a number of large-scale civic works and commercial works, not least of all Tinako Civic Square, Te Matapihi, Te Aonui, maybe a glass of water, in the 80s, then the Adam Art Gallery in 96 to 99, the concept plan for the Wellington waterfront in 1997. He was recognised with the NZIA Gold Medal in 2004 and was knighted in 2015, not long before he passed away at the unfortunately young age of 75. In the 2008 documentary, The Architect of Dreams, directed by Geoffrey Cawthorne, Athfield commented on the likelihood of his work surviving the next generation. We recognise that Athfield had a constructive rather than a precious attitude to built architecture, and so we should not, on his account, be excessively preservationist. However, the quick succession of the demolition of Arlington, the declaration of the Central Library as earthquake-prone, the review of the waterfront, the decline of the civic square, the demolition of the first church. It did feel for a while, or perhaps it's still going on, that there was some bizarre enthusiasm for demolishing Athfield's work now that he'd passed away. That cheerful note. Okay, so the project that we're here to talk about, the first church. The relationship with the first church of Christ scientists began as early as 1971 when the congregation commissioned renovations for their premises on the terrace. This never happened, but they did go ahead and purchase a brownfield site on Willis Street. In 1976, there's records of a two-storey wooden building being demolished at 283 to 85 Willis Street. This is actually looking north down Willis Street towards St. Peter's Church, but we can kind of assume that the building, the two-storey wooden building, would have been that rather familiar style building there on the left. Through 81 to 82, the design was developed with some fairly simple requirements. A meeting space without the traditional symbolism of other Christian sects, space for a Sunday school, and for the accommodation for the organ loft. Within the congregation was one Doreen Bloomhart, former head of art and craft education at the Wellington College of Education, and by that time retired into full-time pottery practice. And here it is as completed in 1983, with its baleful eye staring up into the sky, something extraordinary now and then, somehow both quaint and challenging. So I guess it needs to be acknowledged up front that a heritage building was demolished to build the first church. And as the city has grown, the almost domestic scale of the design of the first church was going to become problematic. However, there are still plenty of low-rise buildings in the area, many of them very ripe for demolition, and even a number of already empty sites that are languishing, waiting for that celestial alignment called a ready market and a sustainable financial investment. Not least of all now is the limbo about what is going to happen to this site. The temporary site office that would have been, the sales point for on-spec selling of apartments has not eventuated, and now Hirepool occupy the site. There is no indication of what comes next. In the oeuvre of Athfield, this first church sits at something of a cusp between the houses of the 70s, with their compact formalism and complex materiality, recycled materials often, and many very crafty elements. This is the Porteous House, designed in 1969 and built progressively, largely by the client, between 1972 and 1975. Neville and Gil Porteous were ceramicists, and the house doubled as a sort of craft factory. Neville passed away last year, but his children still run the Porteous Tiles as a company from the house. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there was the more commercial practice that emerged in the 80s and 90s. So the first church seems to sit between sort of a vernacular craft architecture and something more international, drawing on post-modern semiotics. So this book, the kind of Gerard Melling, also passed away, book kind of summed up the first half of that oeuvre that I was talking about. In the early years of the Athfield practice, these were recorded in Joyful Architecture by Gerard Melling and Tony Athfield. Here, in a rather discursive style, the wildness of Athfield's practice was developed. The language of this book is quite reflexive, and yes, we will admit it, it is quite convoluted, 70s were not a time to talk straight, and it was very much of its era, but it's quite a lovely book, full of lovely architecture. So the first church didn't make it into this book because it was published just beforehand. So Gerard Melling reviewed the first church in the American Institute of Architects journal, just called Architecture, in 1984. Here we see Melling using his language that he often used to describe Athfield's work, the language of Mies and Gaudi, the one of juxtaposition, the juxtaposition of crystalline rigidity and freestyle form. Okay. So the era was the era of Post-Modernism, and the Post-Modernism, I think, should be divided in by these two quite different books. They're both by Venturi, and I suggest that they describe this first book, Complexity and Contradiction, as the title suggests, pursues an architecture of complex formalism. Venturi himself wrote down there in the preface for the reprint that he thought that the book was more historical than topical now that he'd written Learning from Las Vegas and the kind of postmodern obsession with linguistics and semiotics had taken over. But the difference that I'm going to push through is that the complexity and the contradiction is the architecture of Ian Athfield. He is postmodern, but it is of this first part of postmodernity, not semiotics so much in the second part. Okay, so New Zealand's own version of Robert Venturi, sort of, was this lovely man, Dave Mitchell, also passed away. And here he is on a very tiny screen, because it was the little TVs of the old days, presenting the elegant shed on the Kaleidoscope show. In episode 4, Mitchell talked to Roger Walker and Ian Athfield. The first church is not part of the film, but then when The Elegant Shed came out as a book, Mitchell gave it a relatively long write-up. Okay, what do I want to say about that? So at the beginning of this quote, I've just scanned the page so you get like all of its glory. He's talking about how it's hard to have confidence in an architecture that might be based on the chewing gum on the sole of your shoe. I agree, it would be hard. But then we think about Bilbao and we go, oh yeah, that's not a bad idea, let's try it. And then Mitchell and Chaplin go on to talk about the first church. Got to watch out for the mic, because I'm going to make terrible noise. So there's right up the kind of a summary of the baleful eye and the open brief. And then as we get down to the middle, he's talking about the... You're not allowed to laugh at it, guy. It's very serious stuff. I don't know that Dave Mitchell was often serious. He's describing parts of the interior of the building as a J.F. Holden, and then he talks about things looking like women's underwear. It's not very flattering. Until we get to the bottom, when he talks about Athfield allows the sublime innocence of the imagination to appear uncensored in all his finished buildings. It is perhaps his greatest strength. So for all the kind of not so flattering commentary, you then get Mitchell coming in at the end saying, actually, I think this man is brilliant, which is probably true. Okay, so we place the building in between the brutalist, critical, regionalist, expressive kind of late modernism and the semiotics of post-modernism proper. But in fact, when I was looking at the building, and I sort of thought, well, actually, this is where it really seems to come from. This is this is Athfield's design for a school of music. It was a student project, and those kind of blobby forms contrast to the Mesian crystalline forms is really what seems to drive the first church. And just incidentally, when I was my memory was ticking over these, I put Athfield's building next to the Manning Mitchell design for the Auckland School of Music. And I thought, gosh, it feels like there's a resonance that has happened there. And I had a nice quote, which I've just lost. But I'll get on with it. Anyway, so Mitchell teamed up these two buildings in his book, but not overtly. And then, like I say, I'm doing it overtly. Right. The story that I was given, and I was not offended by it, was that Athfield's idea for the first church was the first church. In other words, Solomon's temple. I thought, oh yeah, well that kind of sounds like a good play on words or a bit of a pun. So I dove on into finding out about it. This is just like a kid's book. There's no great architectural reconstruction going on there, but it shows you the important bits. 2 bronze columns out the front, which were called Jashim and Boaz, and a secluded interior. There was a kind of a hidden bit out the back. What else do I want to say? I'll just read it. The first church, a legendary edifice built under the auspices of King Solomon, the second Hebrew king of Jerusalem, recorded in Jewish, Christian and Quranic Bibles as 20 cubits long and 60 cubits wide and 30 cubits high. The temple was said to have stood for 400 years, quite a lot longer than our first church. Though the narrative of this temple, its existence in the human imagination, has been reasserted, rigorously investigated, and the subject of much fantasy. No one can actually say whether the building existed, and this is not because the tons of stone and cedar from which it may have been built have necessarily gone anywhere, but just that archaeologists are not allowed into the Temple of the Mount of Jerusalem to do the excavation. But buildings from the time and bits of archaeological material have been found that do suggest that something very like this was made. Ancient builders were, of course, very frugal, and it is likely that the good bits of the building were not left to be buried. There is an account in the 5th century CE that the Emperor Constantine delivered the Solomic columns to Istanbul, claiming that they were the twisted columns described in King Solomon's first temple. So building parts get moved around quite dramatically through the Middle East and Europe. Archaeologists now suggest that those particular columns in fact came from Greece. So history is full of myths and fictions. So it's the vision of the twisted columns, the pair of them, that inspired Athfield to craft the 2 columns at the front of the church. And in the biblical accounts that I've read, they were described as being capped with lilywork. Here it is with the lilywork being peeled off. Many commented on the columns, As I said, Chaplin and Mitchell and Chaplin described them as women's legs. For Athfield, rather than stone or cedar, the columns were crafted in rather prosaic and expedient resource of terracotta pipes. Their orange-brown burnt umber clay hidden beneath a layer of white glaze. They were then stacked and fitted with reinforced steel threaded through them and filled up with concrete. This on the left is the test column that is now part of the Athfield house. It was built to make sure the system worked. And when I parked my bike in the garden at Athfield's, I found this bit of pipe. And I thought, oh, maybe that's one of the extra bits that they got glazed but then never needed to use. These bits of building that hang around. Okay, so here we can see the interior capitals glazed in white rather than pink, and the construction detailing. Of the process to design these, Neville Porteous is recorded saying, originally I would have liked the column tops to be more integral, growing out of the tops of the posts. When we had to shelve this idea, the problem was to place something around the outside of the columns that still looked good. This idea didn't seem homogeneous enough for me, so Claire stepped in and designed them. I mass-produced them. It all required a great deal of experimentation. Claire, incidentally, had already worked with Porteous for his tiles of the Weddell Crown Building project. Okay, and this is how I saw them. Cut adrift and stacked, felt like everywhere in the Athfield house, stuffed under tables and lying around. Porteous went on to say in that quote, that he had to be paid on an hourly basis because the whole process was so complicated. That the white clay that we had to use in order to get the pink glaze did not have great tensile strength, and it was tricky to handle in its wet state. The pink was also difficult to get. The slightest trace of iron in the clay and you would lose that pink. Frustrating they may have been to create, but the resultant delicate pink glaze is truly intriguing and lovely to look at. So that's the first ceramic work, and this is the second one. As in the biblical description of the Temple of Solomon, in the southeast corner of the courtyard of the temple of the first church, there was an inner court pool, and behind the pool was a weeping wall, and this really should be the most famous of the craft works included in this church. So that's a picture of the model, showing the wall at the top and a little section detail showing the weeping wall. Doreen Blumhardt's weeping wall was pressed from the rocks at Aotearoa Bay on Wellington's south coast. It was a job that Blumhardt described in the 90s as laborious and heavy. Assisted by Jenny Wrightson, Blumhardt rolled about 300 backing tiles onto which the heavily embossed impressions from the rocks were then mounted. Once you know that you're looking at the inverse of the rocks, it suddenly makes a whole lot more sense. What looks like a kind of crusty animal skin is inverted and revealed as something more mineral. So it's been kind of notoriously badly photographed, this work. I just took these ones with my phone, which is like, ooh, that's not going to be up to standard. But it's a beautiful work. There's all these little dips and cutouts set into it that are filled with a green glaze, which we can only kind of imagine running with water. The whole thing would have glistened. So set into the rock impressions are these small rectangles, little precious tile moments. So against the formless, chaotic texture, this sort of stony skin, there is a regular grid of the mounted tile pieces. The work is at once sort of excessive and nothing at all. You could pass it by. And this is where it is now, up in Kandala, outside Athfield's house, as a carport. It's the most expensive carport in the world. No, that's not true, but close. It should be. Okay, so the invitation from the spin-off was not, in fact, to talk about the building, but a single remaining part of it. And that single part that I chose was just the little petal. It's a little piece of the column, and it became sort of fetishized in my imagination, cut loose. And it put me in mind of this haiku from Ezra Pound, the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. The reference is not particularly coherent. The connection is just the petals, but the sentiment is somehow the same. The transience of things and the enlivening moment of chance encounters. It is the anxiety expressed in collage, in modernism, the dislocated image. And there they are. So when we treat items or images or pieces as collage, we are inherently critiquing them. They are cut free from their sort of the context that makes them make sense, and we're sort of floating them in a space that makes them strange and potentially undermines them. If we think of Richard Hamilton's collages or the pop art collages, it was all attacking the kind of normal, conventional consumerist society. It was to collage was to show the weakness of something, to show its kind of incomplete unwholeness. But then later on, we had Colin Rowe talking about the collage city, and he sort of massaged the idea of the collage to say that in fact the urban context was all collage. We have all of these buildings coming and going of different ages sitting next to each other, and they all function in this sort of manner of being rendered strange because of the changing times and context that they live in. However, I think there's another way of thinking of collage, and it's the idea of imagism that comes from Ezra Pound. He was talking about it in terms of poetry. This is 1913, it was a long time ago. But for him, there's a potential with the kind of fragmented image that it provided the opening onto the imagination and the imagination's ability to make patterns and create the context or invent the context around the object. They're all full of complexity and contradiction, one might even say. Anyway, so I began to look very closely at the surfaces while this little object's edges unravelled, connecting first to one thing and then another, and just how a single object claims a place in a complicated web of interconnected life. So this is the little petal with its rusty bolt head that it was covering up, so it was just a cover for the screw head. And those are the eyelets that the pieces of larger pieces of petal were bolted to the column head with. And here we have the little traces. Firstly, there's the 4, that's the construction assembly instructions. There's that texture, that's from when the clay was pushed into a piece of fabric before it was squished into its mould to make the petal shape. And then there's the expanding foam glue, lovely material, that was kind of bogged in the back of the petals to hold them securely onto the columns. And Porteous's little comment about the kind of the non-stretchiness, the lack of elasticity in the clay, that little tear, that's just from the process of manipulating the clay before it was fired. So all of these kind of intensely material and crafty aspects of the building were coming through to me just from these sort of single objects. The first church was, I contend, a rather generous building. It didn't close down on its imagery. More like imagism than collage, there was a possibility to go other places through the building. And this is perhaps why we got so many kind of semi-humorous, semi-patronising associations. It's a whale, it's a turtle, it's a baleful eye. Belling suggested the building wore its heart on its sleeve, and this is always a dangerous thing in the cut and thrust of commercial real estate and the architectural fraternity. The glass facade, the glass facade on the street opened the meeting space of the interior of the church to the public, even if only in a partial way. Within, we can see the even more bent columns of the meeting space, what Mitchell and Chaplin suggested might be a forest. However, there was this gutter, you see, this gutter here, that was glazed so that light would reflect off the water in the gutter and into the building. And when I looked at it, I just thought of a lily pond, some underwater realm, and it reminded me of T.H. White's story, The Once and Future King, which is about King Arthur. And in the opening sequences when Merlin has turned the young Arthur into a fish so that he can swim in the moat of his own castle. It's a dreamy description of shadowy waters suddenly cut short by the arrival of a rather dangerous pike. And it was a lesson for Arthur to see a different world, and one that was just over there, just outside his window. And perhaps this is what the first church also gave us. So I guess my suggestion of what the first church offered and what is now lost was not just a building, but the invitation to imagining. Unlike Te Matapihi, the community was neither able to mobilise fast enough, nor indeed have any right to prevent the demolition of the church. Te Matapihi, conversely, will survive in a different form, and hopefully we will get to feel that difference. It won't be completely smoothed out into a sort of neo-modern architecture, purely contemporary. Perhaps it will keep some of its older qualities, not least of all the columns. I don't think they can get rid of them. The image of the church, of course, will live on as a discursive object. Lovely old Apple Street View. A construct, and potentially through multiple tellings, the building will become cemented into the historical narrative. Unlike Te Matapihi, it won't go on, and it won't evolve, and it won't change. In the semiotic world of Pomo, it'll just be another floating signifier. That is, the complexity and the contradiction of its built form has been truncated by the process of demolition. So there are particular types of work, I argue, that you get to experience with a kind of total otherness. I get it from reading Murakami novels. I got it from doing a noho marae at Tapu Te Ranga Marae before it burnt down. And I get it when I visit Athfield's house in Kandala. These places imagine me to experience not really so much a dislocation, but the possibility of a different way of being. That means that when I come out of it, the world all around me seems strange and odd. The way we're doing things becomes kind of like, oh, maybe we shouldn't be doing it that way. These places allow me to, Athfield suggested that his house was a bit of a utopia. This was him talking on film in 2008. A different version of suburbanism, unlike the bounded version of cars and nuclear families that we were busy building and have been building for the last 100-odd years. Now, while I am sure that Stratum, the developers that now own the First Church site, will build a house of quality where the church once stood, I know that, as they promise on their website, it will change the face of Wellington by answering the needs of the market. Inasmuch as the market is yet another fiction constructed not by the prolific diversity of, say, everyone in this room, but in the kind of reductive, quantitative generalisation, which is called money. The market is another fiction. Are both highly volatile, leave that one. Okay, so writing recently in Architecture New Zealand, Mike Austin had commented on some students' work that he was reviewing and describing it as having a commercially normative quality, which I kind of understood to be consistent with what we now call perhaps neo-modern. It has much of the look of modernism, but many of the mercenary values of the late postmodern pastiche. Perhaps it is because we are all too damn afraid to imagine what this other world that we're heading into is going to be like, this future of the carbon zero and global warming. But this, I argue, is exactly what we need, because the life of the status quo that we have now is going to be short. Yep, that's me.
Thank you very much, Kate. That was amazing. I feel like we travelled from the details of all the craft to the big, looming social...
The horror of the future.
Anxiety
Just
of the
like
future.
that.
I've got a lot to think about. So we have a little bit of time now for questions, and we've got a roving mic. So if you've got a question, pop your hand up and we can get a mic to you. To kick us off, I've got a question about the remaining objects themselves of Athfield's church. Obviously, some of them have become carports, but I'm curious, what do you think the life of these remnants could be?
Well, it's in Zach Athfield's hands, I believe. He did bandy around some ideas when I was talking to him. They'll be installed somewhere. Yeah, I don't know. I'll give you some tips. They have moved down the road slightly. It's 197 that they're in now. It's a sort of a business, what do you call it, like a tower building. Yeah. Yeah, I suspect it was COVID that did them in. That meant they couldn't use the congregation spaces. Nothing online.
How about we all have join me again in thanking Kate for her wonderful presentation, and then please everyone take time and have a drink, have a nibble and have a chat. Thank you very much.